Today we're interviewing who then was Corporal William Malone for the Veterans Historical Project, which was promoted by the Library of Congress through Fairhope Public Library. Corporal Malone is a Korean War veteran where he served with the 3rd Division, 7th Regiment, Charlie Company, 3rd Platoon. Corporal Malone, would you start off telling us about how you arrived at basic training?
I left home and I went to Bayonet, Alabama. I live in Seminole, Alabama, and they had the buses that morning to carry us to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. It was about an 8-hour trip back then or something. And I got at Fort Jackson, and we took 16 weeks of basic. That was 4 weeks of that was a leadership at the end of the 12 weeks of basic. And at Fort Jackson, after I got the basics, well, we were sent to Seattle, Washington, to leave there and go to Japan. Then from Japan, we'd go to Korea. But when I left Fort Jackson, we had to pay our way then. And they gave you so many days, like 8 or 9 days to get to Seattle. So I come by home, and then I caught the bus, and I rode the bus all the way through to California, San Diego, and go up through Oregon, up to Seattle. When I got to Seattle, well, I got on the ship, General Butler, and we went over to Japan. And Japan at that time, they were going to use atomic bomb in the war. So they took the troops there, and we went to 2 weeks of basic training in Gifu, Japan, and it's used to be the Imperial Air Force Base in between 2 mountains in Japan. It never was bombed. And I went to this chemical school there, and we had like a spaceman, and those was chemical, biological, and radiological warfare.
This is the uniform you wore.
The uniform was, they called it then an impregnated suit. I don't know what the men did, but that's what they called it. And when you get sick in there, the instruments go up and all they had on you, and sometimes you get sick and want to vomit, they take you out. And every time you went in, every time you come out, you had to take a bath. And put on, clean suit.
They measured the radiation at the time.
Yeah. And from there, we went over to Korea by fishing boats then. And then we get on trucks, and we rode up that peninsula. It's like getting on in Miami down there and riding up old trucks to the front lines. And we went up there to the front lines, and when I got there, it was night, and they said all of that in front of you is the North Korea, but mostly at that time it was Chinese were fighting. Mm-hmm. And I stayed there my whole tour. You got 4 points a month if you're in war, and you got 2 points if you wasn't in war in the rear. And 9 months, 36 points you had to have, then you come home.
You had mentioned during our pre-interview here that you were associated with the Republic of Korea Army. Folks were integrated in your unit, and you had the Turks and the Belgians. How were they? They were alongside of you?
They call them the ROC, Republic of Korea soldiers. They was assigned in with American troops. And we had a lot of different nationalities in American troops.
And you had the Turks and the Belgians.
The Belgium was on the left flank, and when we got up there and drew the line in the MLR, mainline resistance, and started digging in, well, the Belgians on the left, and the right flank was the Turks.
You had mentioned that the platoon was quite oversized at this time. I think you said you had 64 men in the platoon.
Yeah.
That's unusually large.
Back then, with all the attachments and everything in it, like rock soldier and all, there's 64 men, and there's 60 of them, 15 in a squad, and then you had a platoon sergeant, and you had 2 rock soldiers because they had the experience. They'd been there longer than you have fighting, assigned to you, and it wound up with 64 men.
Since this was a defensive position, tell us about the mad minute that you were exposed to?
After you got in a fight with the enemy and all, and then we would have what we call a mad minute, and you would shoot everything, the 155s, the 105s, the 80s, the 60s, the 30 caliber machine guns, and we would shoot them up in the air, and the war did him and all, to let them know we were ready to fight. We had plenty of ammo.
Okay, and it somewhat intimidated them. Right?
Yeah, intimidate them easy, yeah.
You mentioned the one salient where there was a point of land overlooking a river, and you mentioned the fact that there were Russian tanks there.
Right. On the right flank facing was the Turks that joined to me. Turks are good soldiers. And they're kind of old men, stays in the Army. And they was about 300 yards, which is real close, at the foot of a mountain. And on top of that mountain, well, they was dug in, and they had the Russian-built tanks.
Mm-hmm.
And they would come out of the mountain and shoot, and we'd drop napalm on them. They always go back in, you know.
You were tasked to take those tanks out?
At one time we was. What we'd done though, they began to build up on the hill in front of me, which is 600 to 800 yards in front of me. And then we were going, the infantry take the hill. We had to stay with our tanks to protect our tanks. And we sent out 22 tanks on a retriever to knock out the Russian tanks. And the Russian tanks, and the retriever, in case one breaks down or either gets stuck in the rice paddies, where they like a record, pull them back, you know. And what was kind of fun in that ordeal was we dropped a lot of napalm. And by the time you get there, there ain't nobody to fight.
You mentioned earlier one of the solutions to a night attack that you used is you would use spotlights.
Yeah, if we was going into a place to take, it doesn't make a damn if it's a village, if it's a mountain, the mountain. Say, as soon as we advanced forward, where we would keep raising the spotlight, and the enemy was always, if we was fighting early in the morning, they was a spotlight on them, made daylight for them, and we was sitting in there in the dark. It worked real good. But the spotlight was way behind us. It wasn't on the front, you know. It shot into the cloud and come down.
Okay. You had mentioned earlier that President Syngman Rhee, during one of your times in the areas behind the lines, you were spoken to by President Syngman Rhee, that was president of Korea at that time.
Right.
In a not too complimentary way, as I recall.
The Syngman Rhee was the president of South Korea, and when we went through the towns, we didn't take any chances. Somebody shooting from a building, we destroyed it, and so we saved our lives. And then he called a meeting before I come home, Syngman Rhee. He said that we didn't get the Korean citation because that we was worse than the enemy. He wanted us to leave the building intact and to march on through, you know, and kill the enemy and capture him, whatever. And he can move his civilian population up there, and it didn't have to cost him nothing to fix it back up.
I believe also that you alluded to many years later, you were a guest over at the battleship here in Mobile, Alabama, and President Rhee was addressing the American veterans at that moment. It was quite a moment of irony, and his tone of voice had changed quite a bit.
I do remember we got donuts that day and coffee. 50 years later at the Mobile over here on the battleship, they give us a Korean citation.
They gave you a citation for your effort.
Right, yeah, sure did.
Okay. You had spoken to us about the points were accumulated and how you had to spend a certain amount of time, but what did you feel about, what were the quality of the American troops that were there? Were they excellent fighters, or were they just?
The American troops, when we went over there, we were well trained.
Okay.
And the only thing in that winter of '52 when we was there, is our boots was leather, and so General White, and he recognized that right away, and he recommended in that time right away, real fast. They sent us an insulated boot. We call them Mickey Mouse boot.
Okay. So
but the soldiers was excellent.
Okay.
We didn't lose no ground, period.
And we had
But we had a little communication problem. If you got a man out yonder and he's on a listening post and you know the enemy's going to strike you at 4 o'clock in the morning or something, and he's a Puerto Rican, it's natural when he calls back in, he's excited, he's about to get killed. He can't bug out and come back in, and we right away we start dropping artillery to protect him. But he speaks his language, and if I don't understand, his language, all I know is something's happening. Then we better get on the ball.
Okay. What was the quality of your officers, young officers?
Pardon?
The officers that you had at that time. What was the quality of those? Were they good officers?
The Rocks are real good.
Okay, and the American officers were excellent leaders as well, I'm sure.
Especially the generals.
Okay.
The generals looked at their troops over there. When I was there, I don't know what happened before and after, but the quality of the Rock soldiers and all, it was good.
Okay. We had talked about the MASH series on television. We talked a little bit about the doctors. You said that you felt like they were excellent.
The doctors over there was real good, but it ain't like you see on television. It ain't all that curtains and doors and all that. It's just a big old tent, put up GI tent, and that's about it. And then floors are not paved and concrete and all that. They was in roots and dirt and everything.
I found it interesting to talk with you and your wife earlier. You'd mentioned how little you were paid. How little you were paid at that time.
Oh, I'm sorry. A little hard of hearing, getting old.
Okay.
But back then, when I went in, my wife made $91.30, and I made about $15. And then by being in combat, they paid us $45. So we were making about $150 a month, both of us. And my car payment alone was, when I left home, well, it was $110, so I lost my home, I lost my car the first 2 months I was in the military.
I'm sure you're not alone at that time. Of course, the old joke was you have a roof over your head, but it happens to be a steel helmet. So.
But it works out good.
So you served through March of '53, and the Korean War was over, and you found yourself being sent home almost immediately. Tell us about your trip home.
The trip home was real good. We come into California. They had the table set up. We had the best food in the world. But there's a recruiter when you sign up at every other table.
They were trying to get you to stay in the Army then.
Yeah.
Okay. So you were out of the Army in just a matter of couple days after leaving Korea. It was not long. And you were out of the Army and on your way home.
Yeah, I got out as soon as I did.
Okay. What did you do after you left the Army? What were the opportunities for you then? I believe you said your dad had a convenience store.
Oh, yeah. Back then, my dad had a convenience store, and it was Texaco, and we owned it. And so when I got out of the military, I started helping him and doing some odd jobs on the side to make more money. And so I helped my dad, and I stayed in it, the convenience store. He retired, and I took the convenience store. And I turned it from Texaco to Sidco back in them days because I had traveled a lot and I seen Sidco was going brand back then.
Mm-hmm.
And the store was real successful. And at the store, when I got about 60 years old in 1992, I sold the business and retired and vacationed ever since.
I think you mentioned to me that one of the ways you got started was trucking fruit from Mexico to your father's store, and that led to trucking furniture and you becoming quite an entrepreneur yourself.
Right. As soon as in 1968, I started off, the produce up here wasn't all that good and it's real high. So I took and I called the American Embassy in New Orleans, I called Mexico City and all. And in Mexico City, on the east side and the north side, they had huge farms like California, and it's closer than California. And I started taking a U-Haul truck and hauling produce out of Mexico and bring it up there and sell it to store. While I didn't sell it to store, I was sell it out wholesale to the wholesale companies.
Okay, and then you went into furniture and you started.
And while I was
bringing
down
furniture.
there, when I took the store over around 70, real strong, that me in the store, and my wife and all, and we hired another girl, and I seen the furniture down there real good, and it was cheap, and I would use it.
That led to 2 furniture stores in Pensacola?
Yeah, I went and so I opened a store on 29 in Pensacola and a store in on 9th Avenue in Pensacola. Plus, I had the convenience store, and so I hauled down there and put furniture. Then I started buying the little stuff.
Okay. Well, we thank now Platoon Sergeant William Malone. He started as a corporal. I believe I introduced you as a corporal. But we thank Platoon Sergeant William Malone for his courage in combat in support of the freedom and liberty for the Korean people. And we're grateful for his leadership and his military service, and later in his entrepreneurial skills in the economy of this wonderful nation. Thank you, Sergeant Malone.
Thank you.
Could you trace just a little bit more in Korea what exactly where you were stationed? Could you do that for us?
The longest period of time that I stayed there was north of Seoul. It's kind of in the center, and there's the left of Papasan. They told me, I don't know for sure, but they told me Papasan the biggest hill in Korea. And I was on the left, and there's a creek, like up on this hill here, and there's a creek here. And that picture I had there showed that creek is frozen. And the hills ain't monsters, you know, but they told me that was the biggest hill in Korea. And I was stationed there the most. And I pulled patrol a lot. Even when the MLR, even after the Korean War ended, I was there. In the 53, in the middle of 53. But we still pulled patrols and all. And
were you there when General MacArthur brought troops into Incheon? Do you remember that, or were you?
No, I wasn't in it.
Well, you weren't there. Probably earlier.
No, we were just north of Seoul over there and regarding the road and everything, and it looks like on the map I'm about, you know, a little bit to the west side of you know, the center.
We've had some Navy people interviewed that were flyers, and they were supporting the armed forces, the Army and such. And there was the most of your air support, was that from the Navy or Army Air Corps?
We had a Air Force there called K-16 Air Force Base, and that's where we got our air power from. And they had an ammo dump down there, a big ammo dump. Sometimes we'd have to send a big truck down and get a load of ammo, aiming to last. The napalm is very, very good. I understand they don't use that now. It takes, when they drop it, it just make a dust bowl of the place it drops, and it takes the oxygen out of the air so nobody can live. Because without napalm, I would have probably been dead and a couple hundred men today. Because they got within them 600 and 800 yards of us there, and they was giving us a lot of trouble, you know, the enemy. And so I called in, and they bombed that place with napalm. And when it comes in, it goes in like that. The plane out of K-16, we go in and say, "Whoom!" It's like you have a little fire in the yard, and you strike a match and all, and it go bloom. That's what napalm done, and it plastered that hill. And the way you can tell if you fighting the old timers coming towards you, or young men, you know, that hadn't been in war, the way you do that, if you see the enemy coming, and they start off before daylight in the morning, you know, they always like to attack before daylight. If they hadn't whipped you by daylight, they run and retreat. And if you see them and everybody's coming, and you see them, the fire coming toward you, firepower, say, everybody's shooting, and they ain't shooting at nobody, just shooting, they're scared. But if you see somebody coming toward you, and the enemy's coming, that's an old timer's outfit that's coming toward you. He barely shoots until he sees you. And that's when you have to buckle down. But the United States government, I might have wasted a lot of ammo, but I didn't get nobody killed, you know? When they was coming one time, we was on top of the hill down that valley, and we sent out 22 tanks. They was 1,000. That's in daytime. That's unusual. So they knew they had more men than we got, and they figured they're superior. What do? Very simple. You call in the airstrike. What happens? It gets 10, 20% of them, whatever. Then you call in the 155s, artillery, heavy artillery. It takes out some, and you know, they're getting closer. Then when they get a little closer, you call in the 105s, the 80 millimeters just behind you, and they knock out the rest. And by the time they get to you, they only got 10 or 20% of the men left. And then you use the 60 millimeter mortars and our machine guns and stuff to take the others prisoners. But we took Chinese prisoners more than did North Korea.
This is generally, you're fighting both Chinese and North Korean during
Yeah,
the time?
we mostly fighting China then. At the end of the war, mostly China. And every now and then you get a few North Koreans, you know. But the American Army, if you got good men in there and know what they're doing, it'd never be defeated. But now, me and 3 of my sons has fought every major war. But when the war's over, we get out. My last son, youngest son, well, he's still in there, but he'll be out this year, 20 years. And he's been over in Iraq and Afghanistan, you know. He has to go over and stay a tour, then come home and stay a year or something, then go back over. He was in the invasion of Afghanistan, and it rotated back and forth. And he spent 6 years 2 tours my son did when about 10 or 15 years ago in Korea, where I was at, was the same. He was a sergeant and I was a sergeant, the same place I was at. But you know what's changed?
What's that?
In 60 years since the war started, they draw the line there, you know. All that land in there between is grown up, and it is beautiful. It is beautiful. But the Korean War, we lost a lot of men. But I'm still proud I went in there and done my part. I lost 1 man in 9 months and 1 wounded. And the wounded would come back up and ready to fight. He was a rock soldier. And the other one, it was more or less an accident. But I tell you, it did get cold over there.
Well, we thank you, Sergeant Malone. We
Thank
really
you.
do.
But
Thank you very much.
thank you.